In 401 BC, 10,000 Greek mercenaries marched deep into the Persian Empire, not as conquerors, but as hired swords in a prince's civil war. They expected glory, gold, and a quick journey home. Instead, they would face betrayal, starvation, and the wrath of the greatest empire on earth. This is the story of the 10,000, immortalized by the soldier-philosopher Xenophon, a tale of ambition, survival, and a desperate march through enemy lands to the edge of the world. Our story begins not in Greece but in Babylon. Cyrus the Younger, a Persian prince with dreams of the throne, sought to overthrow his brother, King Artaxerxes' IITO win. Cyrus needed elite warriors, disciplined, fearless, and most importantly, not Persian. He turned to Greece, where thousands of unemployed veterans sought purpose after the Peloponnesian War. Cyrus offered them silver, glory, and adventure. The mercenaries, led by seasoned generals like Cyrus and Menon, joined his cause, not realizing they were marching into the heart of Persia itself. They marched east across the Tigris and Euphrates, through villages that whispered rumors of their true mission. Even the Greek soldiers began to suspect something was wrong. When the truth finally came out that they were part of a rebellion against the great king, it was too late. They had marched over 1,000 kilometers from home. At Cunaxa near Babylon, the two brothers' armies met. Cyrus' Persians on one side and Artaxerxes' massive imperial host on the other. The Greeks crushed the Persian left flank, shields locked, spears thrusting in disciplined rhythm. But in the chaos, Cyrus charged toward his brother and was struck down. The battle was won, but the war was lost. The Greeks, still undefeated on the field, suddenly realized they had no employer and no way home. Stranded in the heart of an empire that wanted them dead, the 10,000 faced one impossible mission: to march home through mountains, deserts, and enemies without maps, allies, or supplies. Their odyssey, the Anabasis, was about to begin. And every step would test the limits of courage, discipline, and survival. The day after Cunaxa, silence blanketed the desert. The Greeks stood victorious but surrounded. Their Persian allies had vanished, and their leader Cyrus lay dead. The 10,000 had become ghosts in the middle of an empire. Artaxerxes' generals offered peace if the Greeks surrendered their arms. But Cyrus, the Spartan commander, knew what Persian peace meant. He refused. Instead, they formed a hollow square, shields outward, spears bristling, and began marching north toward home. For days they were shadowed by horsemen, taunting them from afar, arrows hissing like insects in the sun. Every river crossing was a battlefield, every meal a fight for survival. Then came treachery. A Persian satrap named Tissaphernes invited the Greek generals to a peace meeting. They went unarmed. They never returned. Cyrus and the leaders were executed. The army was leaderless, lost, betrayed, deep in enemy territory. And that's when Xenophon, a young Athenian philosopher-soldier, stepped forward. He gathered the men under a moonless sky and spoke. "The enemy is ahead and behind. But our path is home." That night they chose Xenophon as one of their new commanders. By dawn, the 10,000 were moving again, faster, quieter, more disciplined than ever. They crossed rivers waist-deep in mud, climbed freezing ridges, and fought through ambushes that never seemed to end. When their food ran out, they ate their pack animals. When their shoes rotted, they wrapped rags around their feet. And when the Persians blocked a mountain pass, the Greeks charged uphill under a storm of arrows. Winter came. The plains turned to ice, the mountains to walls of white. Men collapsed in the snow, cursing their gods, their leaders, and their fate. But still they marched. At last, after months of struggle, they reached the mountains of Armenia. And there, high in the frozen wind, a cry rose from the front ranks, desperate, breaking, but filled with joy. "The sea! The sea!" they shouted. It was the Black Sea, the edge of the Greek world. For the first time in almost a year, they saw home. They had crossed an empire on foot. Outnumbered, starving, hunted, yet unbroken. And Xenophon would later write, not of victory or conquest, but of endurance. Their story, the Anabasis, became a manual of leadership, courage, and survival. For centuries, it inspired explorers, soldiers, and dreamers who marched into the unknown. 10,000 Greeks walked into Persia. Maybe only a few made it home. But their march would echo for thousands of years. For the men who survived, the war was over. But peace, that was still miles away. When they reached the Greek colonies on the Black Sea, Trapezus, modern-day Trabzon, they found no rest, only more hunger. The locals feared the 10,000 as invaders. Supplies were scarce, and the soldiers had no gold to pay. So like ghosts, they drifted from one coastal city to another, not conquerors now, but beggars in armor. And yet they still called themselves soldiers. They refused to dissolve, refused to scatter. They marched under the same banners that had led them into Persia, now torn, but still flying. Xenophon, more philosopher than general, saw what they had become. An army without a country, a living proof that discipline and courage could outlast even nations, he wrote. They were at once soldiers, exiles, and survivors, men who carried Greece on their backs. But the journey home was not yet done. They still had to cross the mountains of Pontus and Bithynia, lands of raiders and frost. Many cities refused them entry. Some sent out troops to block their path. And so the Greeks, the same men who had survived Persian armies, found themselves fighting other Greeks. It wasn't glory anymore. It was survival. The march that began with ambition now became a test of the soul. They plundered when they had to, prayed when they could, and buried their dead when there was time. And slowly, painfully, they made their way west toward the Aegean, toward home. Months turned to a year. The 10,000 were now closer to 5. They had crossed the heart of the Persian Empire, the mountains of Armenia, and the chaos of the Black Sea coast. When they finally reached Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul, they stood on the edge of the world they once left behind. But what awaited them was not celebration. The Greek cities saw them as mercenaries, armed, starving, dangerous. No heroes welcomed. Just closed gates and suspicious eyes. Xenophon, tired of politics and betrayal, left the army soon after. He turned to writing, hoping that ink could achieve what steel could not, memory. And through his work, the Anabasis, he gave the 10,000 a victory greater than anyone on the field. He gave them immortality. In his words, the march became more than a retreat. It became a parable about leadership, loyalty, and the cost of ambition. Generals from Alexander the Great to Napoleon studied Xenophon's account. It became the manual for survival in impossible odds, not through divine favor, but through human will. Alexander himself, before invading Persia decades later, reportedly kept a copy of the Anabasis by his bedside. Because he too would march into Persia, but unlike the 10,000, he would never turn back. As for Xenophon, he lived out his days in exile, writing, reflecting, always an outsider, a Greek who had seen too much of the world. He died far from Athens. But his story, and the story of the 10,000, traveled further than any soldier ever could. 2.5 millennia later, their march still echoes, in every army trapped behind enemy lines, in every desperate retreat that refuses to break. Because sometimes history's greatest victories are the ones no one intended to fight, and that is the story of the 10,000. A band of men who walked into the heart of the Persian Empire, and somehow walked out again.